set ourselves free as we should be.
Thanks everybody for joining us today for another free history program. I'm Will Haynes of the Watkins Museum of History. Free History is a series of programs exploring connections between events of the past and events and movements that we're concerned with today. In the late 1970s, a motley group of progressive activists came together to challenge the Ku Klux Klan and similar groups of white supremacists. This progressive group chose a famous 19th century abolitionist as their namesake. Now Hilary and James Tracy have chronicled the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee in a book released last year. So this is the subject of today's event. So first of all, thank you, Hilary and James, for joining us today, and welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Glad to be here.
Absolutely. And I'd like to start off by asking Hilary and James to please give us a little of your backgrounds and describe how both of you first learned about this John Brown Anti-Klan Committee. So Hilary, could you start off?
Yeah, for sure. I just want to say again, thanks for having us, and thank you for everybody joining. It's always a pleasure to meet with other history nerds. So excited to get into a little bit about the book and then also just chat with each other and hear what your questions are. My name is Hilary, she and her pronouns. I was born and raised on Ohlone territory in California, but right now I'm in Berlin, Germany. And really came to the book because necessity. That was how it happened. And maybe you all remember what was happening in the beginning, in the middle of 2016, when President Donald Trump was gearing up and ramping up his presidential campaign, and just the onslaught of white supremacist organizing that was accelerating, that was becoming way more public. And I was doing anti-racist political education with an organization called Catalyst Project. Maybe people know about them. They do anti-racist political education and work with grassroots groups. So we were doing trainings with folks in Kentucky and Arkansas, and really Trump's presidential campaign really changed kind of everything of what we were up to, right? We had typically done work with organizations looking at how white supremacy shapes our internal cultures or the policies of institutions that we're up against. And then now, in an unprecedented way at the time, having to contend with white supremacists in the flesh and what that means and what shifted in the work. And then related to that, and around the same time, I went to a counter protest to challenge white supremacists that had planned a demonstration in Sacramento at the Capitol. And that was the first time that I had seen anybody be stabbed. White supremacists stabbed at least 5 people. And then I saw mounted police officers protect the same white supremacists who had just stabbed other counter protesters. And that really fucked me up, and that really shook me up. And I really was, chatting with friends, but trying to figure out who had done this work before and how had they done this work, and what did they learn, and what's different about that moment in the 80s of, what we talk about in the book, the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, and what's different or the same today. And so in those conversations, I was reaching out to people who were former members of the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee and talking with them, making sense of what was happening under Trump. And in those conversations also was talking with James and being like, what do we do with all this information? And I know that he's a big history nerd, and he wrote Hillbilly Nationalists with Amy Sunny, which is another really important book, history book for any other movement history nerds too. And so we were chatting it up and we decided to write the book together.
Great. Yeah, I first met the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee when a member, who I believe was Lisa Roth, but it was back in 1989. And I'm not quite sure, but a member sold me a newspaper. I grew up in Vallejo, California, which is right outside of San Francisco, a Navy town at the time. and Nazi skinheads decided to come and try to organize in our town. They organized what they call Aryan Woodstock, which was a white power concert. There was lots of counter mobilization, protests, controversy. Keep in mind that then and now Vallejo is one of the most diverse cities in the country. And a lot of us were, were absolutely offended and objected to the idea that, that these Nazis, these skinheads, would come and try to organize and deploy us against our friends that we had already always grown up with. The John Brown Anti-Klan Committee were one of the groups, one of the leading groups that came to town to try to counter mobilize. And I was, walking to my job. I was a janitor at the time, and met a member of the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee, and we got into a long debate about organizing and politics. But I was I respected their just respected their fortitude and their bravery to come. It was very very challenging thing to come to a town that you were not part of, organize against these violent skinheads that were coming to our town. So I've been fascinated by them ever since, and thanks to Hilary, had the opportunity to delve deep into their stories.
Well, it's very interesting, and it's clear to see that you both have very personal histories of challenging whites, being confronted by and challenging white supremacy, and also with the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee. That's fascinating. So let's dive into the history of this organization a little bit. Your book situates the committee in the context of an energized white supremacist movement in the late 70s and 80s. So Hilary, who formed the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee, and where did they form it?
Yeah, well, I think importantly, it started off in the Northeast, but it became a national network with multiple chapters. So those are some like basic logistics about the organization. But I think what's really interesting and really important is why they formed. And broadly speaking, they formed as a call, like they were responding to a call for community defense. And that call was put out by incarcerated leaders within Black liberation struggle. And this was 1977. And what they were doing, these leaders who were incarcerated were trying to create a public pressure campaign and put pressure on the fact that Klan members were not only employees of New York State prison system, but they were using that institutional power to harass and also organize in the institution. And so they put out this call, and the people who responded to that call would eventually become the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee. And what they did was they stepped into a buffer role against those attacks, as well as really amplifying the demands of the people who were incarcerated. It's really, we found out a bit further into the research, or like it became clear that actually the media already knew, and many people in New York already knew, that the Klan was employed and organizing in the prison system, but not a lot was happening around it. And I think it was a lot of racism within the media to not take the demands of the leaders incarcerated seriously. But the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee worked to really change those conditions. So they mobilized, right? They put pressure on the prison, they put pressure on the governor, they put pressure in the community. Not only to fire the Klan members, but for better living conditions for the people incarcerated, and really an end to the harassment that they faced. And I think an important part in all of this is kind of zooming out, right? That was 77, but if you zoom out and understand the conditions of the time, you can understand that what was happening was a lot of fallout from the counterintelligence program from the government. Right? So social movements of the 60s and 70s had been really ravaged by the government through COINTELPRO, harassment, infiltration, surveillance, disruption, and murder of movement leaders. So this idea of community self-defense wasn't just reserved for defense against white supremacist groups, but it was also in defense from law enforcement and the arms of the state as well. And they really connected that to, power and punishment really ravaging communities home and abroad. So they had critiques of imperialism. And they were also really responding to those early indicators of how the new right would consolidate itself, and especially under Reagan in the next following 10 years.
Yeah. Well, James, this question is a little off the cuff, so forgive me, and I'm surprised that I didn't think of this before, but why did the committee choose this 19th century abolitionist as their, as the name of their group?
I really love that question. Been thinking a lot about it, and I think to understand it also, to back up a little bit and think about how John Brown, is as a symbol, right, in the activist imagination, and the artistic imagination, and the political imagination. So, as early as the turn of the century, Black activists were doing a lot of writing, talking about John Brown. Du Bois, probably one of the most famous ones, but there's a fantastic book called Allies for Freedom and Blacks on John Brown that's available that you can delve into this. And, many different dynamics come forward from that. But the number one thing is just dependability, right? So we see in the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King famously questioning the reliability and the follow through and the alliances of white liberals, right? So, and as the various coalitions that formed around and were inspired by the Black Freedom Movement came, obviously the quality of coalitions and came into question. There's also another very good book called not Protectors of Privilege. I'll get back to that. But anyhow, we see so we see John Brown emerging as a symbol for claimed largely by white activists that signals, hey, we're going to be the ones that will always have your back. We are the reliable allies, collaborators, whatever term you might like to use today. And and it's signaled towards a certain type of militancy that many of these organizations wanted to project. Similarly, you had folks in the center and the right using John Brown's image as a warning around militancy. Right. You had if it was John Brown was just a crazy man with good intentions, but he went far too far in his pursuit. Kirk Mearsham wrote back in the 30s a play on this, just with the thesis that as John Brown as a madman, and we see these things. So it was a nice kind of counterpoint that if these characters were saying John Brown was a madman, of course we wanted to want to claim that. But it wasn't just wasn't only the right and the center that had some wariness around around claiming John Brown. Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, certainly not part of the right, actually had a political education workshop to discourage their white collaborators from emulating John Brown and instead working under the leadership of SNCC and black leaders. It's very, very complicated because, of course, John Brown himself had very strong relationships with Harriet Tubman and many others during the time. So just like anything, history is always much more nuanced and complicated than activists of any side of the spectrum might like to claim.
Well, that's certainly true. And you mentioned a minute ago the sort of the dangers, but the opportunities of coalitions. So with what movements and groups did members of the committee ally themselves in their work? Hilary, do you want to start us off there?
Yeah, for sure. I remember one interview, I think it was with Terry Bisson, who, by the way, is a John Brown Anti-Klan Committee member and one of the founders, who later went on to be a historian of John Brown and wrote extensively, and even wrote like speculative future fiction about what if John Brown and Harriet Tubman had won. And he has incredible poetry. I really recommend checking out his work. But one of the things that was important, I remember him saying, I believe, or maybe it was someone else. I think it was somebody else. Anyways, they were saying that the organization wouldn't have happened. The John Brown Anti-Klan Committee would not have been in existence. They wouldn't have done what they did if it wasn't for the community and the relationships that they had. Never would they have just done this because they thought it was a good idea, but rather they were part of a larger strategy that they figured out with more people, and that was really conscious of history and really took history into account, which informed their actions. But like on the practical level, they had close relationships with the Black Liberation Army, the Republic of New Africa, the Puerto Rican independence movement, and just generally people and networks who were part of movements for self-determination, right? So people who were very much shaped by the idea that the oppressed groups, oppressed communities, oppressed nations have the right to resist, right? And they can do that in a way that it becomes successful for them. So it's not determined by the oppressor. And they have the ability to govern their own lives and build economic and political power. So that was like some of the core foundations for how they built coalitions and found themselves in relationship with movement partners, basically. But then local chapters also had their own relationships and different kinds of coalitions with different kinds of groups who sometimes had a very different set of politics. So in Austin, the Austin chapter worked with the Brown Berets and the Black Citizens Task Force. Importantly, yeah, they didn't all share the same political line. And over time, they learned the skill of working in coalition. They didn't come in with it at all, actually. But they learned that challenging white supremacists and trying to build a united front against fascism in many ways builds a left when other conditions might not allow it. So it's almost like low-hanging fruit. And then the question is, how long can you keep those coalitions going? But I think the Chicago chapter also had some pretty incredible ways of building large coalitions. So I'll turn that over to James.
Yeah, the Chicago chapter I thought was was pretty instructive. You have a group of organizers and activists affiliated with John Brown who arrive, and one of the stories that was shared with us was mounting a big speaker on top of a car and running around white neighborhoods, imploring everybody to support the Black Revolution, support Black political prisoners, and never really getting out of the car. I think anybody listening might agree that that's probably not the most effective way to reach somebody with a message. Basically, drive-by organizing. But as they were good organizers. They learned to knock on doors. They learned to to go to parks and set up tables to listen to people and to build really broad coalitions. I mean, and keep in mind that we always think of organized white supremacy, Klan style, as something that happened down in the South. Chicago being being one of the headquarters of the Klan. We might all remember the scenes in the Blues Brothers that really reflected this in a humorous kind of way. But when they started counter mobilizing against the Klan and associated groups, they brought together faith groups, they brought together community groups, they brought together people that probably did not share even half of their long-term politics. They reached out to anti-racist skinheads and brought them in, and also recognized how important culture was, both through their engagement with punk rock, but also through the very famous moment of intervening with the Oprah Winfrey show when she was interviewing members of the National Front there. So and bringing together young men and women, so anti-racist skinheads, into the audience to argue against it, because they knew that they knew that they had to intervene in that platforming experience.
That's fascinating. Well, the committee was active from 1977 to 1992, I believe, before the internet was around to facilitate protests and organization. So, of course, I barely remember. I was around before the internet, but I barely remember what that was like myself. And I'm a historian too. So I'd like to know, how did the committee spread the word about their activities? And also, well, maybe I'll start with that question. Hilary, could you answer that for us?
Yeah, sure. Well, one thing that I love, and I think James was alluding to it before, is that the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee really tried everything. And, technically, perhaps the organization ended in '92, but what really happened is they moved on to other work because the political conditions were shifting. But I feel like one of the lessons, and we can get to it later, is that they still continue to try everything to see what works. And that kind of flexibility and that kind of long-term commitment is super valuable and necessary still today. Yeah, they tested the waters to see what tactics worked where, especially in the early days when they were mobilizing against Klan members being employed by New York State prisons. They were prolific in flyers and making old school flyers and copying those and putting them everywhere. Posters, they were prolific writers. It made research really easy in that way, because you could trace their statements across the span of the organization. Or for instance, when there was particular leaders that they were trying to support who were incarcerated, they would start chapters in the towns nearby, and those chapters would act as support mechanisms for that inside organizing. And so they would do book groups, they would do study groups, they would bring people from that local area into that context. I loved writing and learning about the Austin chapter. They really tried kind of everything. They did everything from organizing self-defense classes as a way to bring white people into the struggle against white supremacy. They also went to schools and had conversations with young people about basically the Klan coming to town and what that means and how to make meaning out of it. And they would do kind of the background work that just needed to get done. So when the Black Citizens Task Force needed members driven to demonstrations or to meetings, they would just do it and make sure it happened. And I think one of my favorite stories, and here is where the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee got creative around how class and capitalism plays different parts in challenging white supremacy. In 1983, in Richmond, California, so they had a Bay Area chapter, a group of police officers who had for years been known as the Richmond Cowboys, who were a Klan-like group and who were very much known for harassing, intimidating, and murdering Black men. They were finally on trial. And the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee started to work with the lawyers and the NAACP and local community groups and try to have outside pressure to help shape the narrative of what was happening inside the courtroom. And through the proceedings, they found out that these Richmond Cowboys would pick up young Black men and drive them to rich and affluent neighborhoods and drop them off, knowing that the police and the white communities, the rich white people out there, would call the cops on them and they would go through another legal process and possibly harassment and brutality. And so what the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee did, knowing that they were white and had access to space in a different kind of way, they held protests in those affluent neighborhoods. Instead of protesting and demonstrating in the neighborhoods that people were experiencing the violence of policing, they went to the neighborhoods where the police were from. And they even went to the house of the police chief who let the Richmond Cowboys exist for all of those years. And they held demonstrations outside of his house. Another fun one is that they, around the same time, they organized a community running event, like a marathon, and people got to like sponsor and fundraise, and they would run around Lake Merritt in Oakland, California. And that money would go towards anti-Klan demonstrations, but also towards movement partners. So I think that's a short list of the many ways that they were doing the work that they were doing, depending on where they were, which is really important.
Yeah. James, did you have something to add? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just add that, the history of John Brown Anti-Klan Committee isn't exactly hidden history, largely because they were so masterful at getting their messages across and using their demonstrations to get into mainstream news media. We, in my previous book, we had to really find the files and the photos and the notes in people's basements. In this book, we found them in the New York Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Austin Post, things like that. And it was because they had a really good, great media strategy to use these moments of conflict to get ideas out. But they were also very masterful at understanding young white anger, and they understood that punk rock was contested territory, right? And that young white people, largely working class, but not only, were gravitating towards this new countercultural movement, or newish countercultural movement. So they engaged with groups like the Dead Kennedys and the Dicks and many others, to have have benefits, to have events where people could come, discuss ideas, and really turn a lot of the anger towards towards racists instead of horizontally towards people of color. I think that was a pretty important understanding of the role of culture in in building a sense of revulsion towards racism, which is really important in a populist moment like the one that we still live in today.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And we'll get more into the connections with today in a minute, but it just sounds like the members of the committee were pretty ingenious in all the different ways that they found to reach out to people. Coming from New York State myself, I was shocked to learn about how extensive the Klan was up there in the 1970s, up south, as you quote Malcolm X calling it. It was pretty shocking to read about, but it was also gratifying to read about how the committee took this circumstance and used it to organize in that area. So James, could you give us a favorite fact or some favorite anecdotes from the research that you did?
Yeah, I mean, I think that throughout this book, John Brown Anti-Klan Committee, their members, I was really moved just by their level of commitment and their ability to learn and grow. And it would be easy to skim our book and get really fixated on particular ideologies or whatnot. But what really moved me was the fact that they kept going even after John Brown Anti-Klan Committee was dissolved. These were all people who came from movements of the 60s and 70s, and trying to apply these lessons, their values, to the 80s was really difficult, right? It was in the 1960s, a lot of our participants thought by the 1980s they would have some sort of anti-racist social democratic republic in the United States, or several. And obviously in the 1984, it looked a lot more like in 1984. Skip forward to 1992, and we have former members of John Brown really starting to develop what we now call abolitionist politics, and waging battles against the prison industrial complex, not just calling for the release of political prisoners, but really sounding the alarm about the mass incarceration that is now fairly well acknowledged across many parts of the political spectrum. And participation, certainly growing up in the Bay Area, I have a big soft spot in my heart for ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, for all the important interventions that they did during that horrible time. And we see John Brown Anti-Klan Committee members playing major roles in supporting and building up that development. So, there's the old saying that you keep your values constant, but your tactics flexible. I think that we see that happening quite a bit throughout this history. And should also mention that I'd say 90% of John Brown Anti-Klan Committee members are still active in some way today, and that's a pretty remarkable feat given all they saw.
So your book is not just the history of the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee. You use their story as a guide for today's movements. So what are some of the lessons that this earlier band of activists, although as you both indicated, many of them are still active today, but what are some of the lessons from the committee that progressives could use today? Hilary?
Yeah. I mean, one interesting thing about writing a movement history book, and to be clear, I think it should be clear from how I shared who I am. I wasn't a historian. I have not been trained in being a historian, but why we came to this book, or why I came to this book, was because of a need in the movement, and learning the skills of writing history in such a way of foregrounding the things that are true and exist for everybody to be able to make assessments of today, but then also feeling for which aspects are most relevant or most useful, and that being the whole purpose of why write something, right? If you write something that no one understands, that's not very helpful. So the whole point was really to draw out the lessons. So the first few chapters really are about the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee and the story, and then the last chapter is me and James making assessments about what do we glean from it? What meaning do we make out of it? And, it's already present here, but I think one of the things that makes the organization worthy of study is how they went about solidarity. Not only how they went about it, but how true they held it in a particular way. So yes, they challenged the Klan. That's super important. Yes, they challenged Klan-like groups, both within government institutions, as well as US history and culture. But they did this because there was a major threat to people fighting for self-determination, right? So movements that didn't wait for the US government to bestow equal rights or protection. So working with organizations that really felt the pressure of the Klan and white supremacist organization, and really needing strategic partners and allies and accomplices and all the kind of stuff. But it was strategy and choice. And I feel that's an important lesson for today, right? Making decisions together and doing that based on our actual assessments of what is real in current time, and not some fictional illusion or just something that is sexy or interesting. So being current in our history, that's very important. And I think another important thing that the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee did was played an amplifying role, right? So based on those relationships, they uplifted those visions, those methods, those wisdoms from those movements, and over their 13-year arc really changed their structure and tactics. So really what James just said, right? The principles remained a through line, and then they stayed flexible in how they did that work. And I can tell you, as being a part of white anti-racist organizations, at least the last 10 years, that's not easy. It's really not easy. And so it wasn't so much, I think you mentioned they were super ingenious and hella smart about it. Of course they were, absolutely. But I think what the wisdom in there is a flexibility. in being able to adapt over time and respond to those conditions. And the important questions that I feel like were really pertinent for them and how they made those changes, but still are relevant today, are really around, are there ways of confronting racists and fascists that don't provide them a new opportunity to spread their message, right? That's super important. And they explored ways to do that. So here's some options and models that we get to choose from. How are alliances and solidarity best strengthened given the shifting complex relationships between primarily white organizations and organizations of color? There's no formula, so you have to actually be in relationship with people. That's actually very important. Another question is, how do activists prepare for possibilities of violence and self-defense against groups that always seem eager for bloody battles, right? There's certain ways that you approach doing the work that's both holding a line as well as demonstrating a different world that we actually want to be a part of and that people want to join. And really all of these pieces are important to peel white people away from the methods, the tactics, the power grab that is happening on a global level. There's a rightward global shift. And so how do we get our folks back? I'll pass it to James.
So before I answer your question, I'll just say that when our editor, the wonderful Greg Ruggiero, came and said, "Hey, I want your last chapter to have lessons," I really struggled with it because as a writer, part of my heart was like really wanted to tell people's stories, amplify the different voices, and let the reader make up their own mind. And I still invite all of you readers to read this book and make up your own minds about what's in it based on what we represent. But I think that for me, I think it does come down to what I said before. When the system is in crisis, as it is today, we have populist moments. That populist moments can go towards the politics of scapegoating your neighbors, scapegoating people who have much in common with you, or it can go towards looking at how do we change the systems for for a better day for all. And there's only one way to go there, and the right understands this, right? The people who would like to pull us towards a politics of scapegoating understand that you have to put boots on the ground, that you have to have an exciting and compelling narrative based in music, based in stories that build a sense of commonality, a common, or common sense in the Gramscian term. And I think that the left has, many parts of the left really understand this as well, but we really have to make the politics of solidarity cool again, irresistible, and a force that can also show some really some really big results in order to make shifts in consciousness, something that actually benefits us all, or else we'll be we'll be in this position that we're in for quite a long time. And I think collectively the people of this occupied territory called the United States can actually transcend and imagine wildly different ways of being.
Well, very well spoken, both of you. And thank you very much for lending some time from your work today to speak with us all.